Hello, and welcome to today's public health webinar series, Legalized Recreational Marijuana, What Does It Mean for Your Health? Today's program is sponsored by the Rutgers School of Public Health in partnership with the Region 2 Public Health Training Center, which is housed at the Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health in New York City. At the end of today's webinar, our hope is that participants will be able to explain important differences between inhaled and ingested cannabis products, be able to identify patterns of public health consequences seen in states with legalized recreational marijuana, and also be able to describe targets of prevention and surveillance that ensure public safety, including the role of regional poison control centers. The public health core competencies to be addressed today include 2B7, 6B3, and 6B4, and these can be found in the core competencies for public health professionals. As always, after today's webinar, we will post the recorded version onto the Rutgers Training YouTube channel, and that address is here on the screen. In addition, the program will be posted at train.org, which is a national clearinghouse of public health education programs, and we certainly encourage you to visit that site. We're using Zoom webinar today, and the chat bubble where you can type in questions appears at the bottom of your monitor. We hope to be able to answer a few questions, at least, in the last few minutes of today's program. We're delighted today to have with us Dr. Diane Calello, who is the Executive and Medical Director of the New Jersey Poison Control Center at Rutgers, New Jersey Medical School, Department of Emergency Medicine. Dr. Calello received her BA from the College of William and Mary and her MD from New Jersey Medical School. She completed residency training in pediatrics and fellowship training in both pediatric medicine and medical toxicology at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and Poison Control Center in Philadelphia. Dr. Calello is board certified in pediatrics, pediatric emergency medicine, medical toxicology, and addiction medicine. Okay, and Dr. Calello, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. And I'd like to thank the School of Public Health and all of you for dialing in today to hear about a topic which I think is on everybody's mind right now, which is the legalization of recreational marijuana. So legalized recreational cannabis is a huge topic with many implications, both positive and negative, in many realms. And it could fill a week of lectures. But this lecture will focus on the impact of legalized recreational cannabis in the realm of public health specifically, and with particular focus on preventable safety considerations and adverse effects. I should start by saying anytime a drug is introduced, whether it's a cholesterol drug or a recreational drug, there will be adverse effects. That is just going to happen. So today, we're going to talk about how to proceed wisely to anticipate and prevent them and monitor the ones that do occur. I have nothing to disclose. But first, some of you might be wondering why the director of the Poison Control Center is speaking on this topic. I find that to some people, the Poison Center is the place you call when a child drinks a cleanser from under the sink or eats a spider plant, but people don't really sometimes think of us as having a role in management and surveillance of drug abuse and overdose statewide, but we absolutely do. We're a 24/7, 365 hotline, and the phones are answered by healthcare professionals, doctors, pharmacists, and nurses who are certified in poison information. So we call them SPIES, which is kind of a funny name, and that stands for Specialist in Poison Information. That's who picks up the phone when you call the New Jersey Poison Control Center. They are backed up and supervised by a team of faculty, physician, medical toxicologists. So that's me, that's some of our faculty here at Rutgers, and other toxicologists in the state who work with us at NJPIES. We provide emergency help, informational support in many languages, and in addition to advising the public, when exposures occur, we advise healthcare professionals in hospitals, pre-hospital settings, nurses, EMTs, et cetera, in a variety of poisoning exposures, including drug overdose. In addition to that management advice, we conduct ongoing surveillance to detect outbreaks in real time. So you can see here on the right, we maintain an instantaneous GIS map here at NJPIES at all times. On the right here is just a snapshot of a particular day. But this is what it looks like on the screen outside my office. So we keep an eye on this all the time. We keep an eye on the running board to see what exposures are happening and if anything looks unusual. In addition to that, every 8 minutes, we upload all of our data to a national server, and that's the National Poison Data System, which connects all the cases coming into all 55 poison centers across the US. This allows us to detect outbreaks and threats that may occur across state lines or in clusters where if we only have one view of New Jersey, we might not realize it's also happening in New York or Pennsylvania, et cetera. So I think it's a really powerful tool. This came into play earlier this year when out in the Midwest, there was a cluster of patients who were using synthetic cannabinoids, which is a bit different than cannabis, which we'll talk about in a second, but patients were using synthetic cannabinoids, which are bad news anyway, but it turns out that that drug was contaminated with rat poison, and patients were coming in with this unexplained, life-threatening, and sometimes fatal bleeding from using this drug that was contaminated with rat poison that causes bleeding. So that was identified in large part by compiling the experience of several poison centers and doing that surveillance. So we do take a lot of calls pertaining to either drug abuse, misuse, overdose, and whether it's a pharmaceutical or a recreational drug. And you can see down here on the left is an example of some of the cases we get as it pertains to marijuana. So an adult female called, she accidentally ate a commercially prepared edible. She's agitated, disoriented, having difficulty breathing. This is the kind of calls that we sometimes get. So marijuana or cannabis. So I will use the terms interchangeably for the purpose of this talk, but the term marijuana is really slowly giving way to cannabis, and I think we will stop saying marijuana in short order. Cannabis reflects the botanical source of the drug. Marijuana has a historical, possibly ethnic and pejorative implication. So we're saying cannabis as much as we can, although I will flip back and forth. It's a mind-altering psychoactive drug, comes from the buds and leaves of the female cannabis plant, whether that's sativa or indica. Most of it is sativa that people classically think of, but it can be both. Goes by a lot of street names and has been used since the beginning of time, many thousands of years BC even. There are records of cannabis extracts or seeds or leaves being found in tombs, et cetera. So we know this has been around a really long time. And at present, the UN estimates that roughly 5% of the total world population has used cannabis. And in the US, about 22 million Americans, 8% of the population, are current cannabis users. So we know it's common, it's out there, and we're in a time in which cannabis policy in the US is undergoing a major transformation. Just 2 weeks ago, in the election, or maybe 3 weeks ago now, Michigan voted to add legalized recreational marijuana. They moved from having a medical-only product to also legalizing recreational use. And 2 more states, Utah and Missouri, brought in medicinal marijuana. There are now 11 states in which legalized recreational marijuana is being established. Just to clarify, what do those terms mean? So medicinal or medical marijuana is what we have right now in New Jersey. It's marijuana or cannabis products can be dispensed to patients who have one of the approved indications, and they go to a limited select network of medical marijuana dispensaries to obtain the product. That's medical marijuana in broad strokes. Decriminalization is essentially that it is not against the law to have marijuana, and it prevents people from having legal consequences for the possession and use, but does not legitimize or license the sale, the retail sale of marijuana. Legalization is the next frontier. And I really, in terms of cannabis access, I think of the progression from medical marijuana to decriminalization to legalization as a continuum. Legalization implies establishing a framework for the retail sale, purchase, and possession of cannabis products for residents older than 21 years of age. And that's what we're looking at right now here in New Jersey. So it's not just that it's not criminal, it's also, it's legal and it is regulated and kind of assisted by a state or essentially official framework. So things are definitely starting to move in New Jersey. Just this past November, as in last month, a bill was reviewed by joint legislative committees to legalize the possession and personal use of an ounce of cannabis or less in people over 21. It makes several other provisions, including expedited expungement of prisoners and home delivery, and it would license cultivators, processors, wholesalers, and retailers, and change the official language from marijuana to cannabis. So that is now going before the full legislature for review and vote. So let's talk about the chemistry and the pharmacology. What are these compounds and how does it impact the body? So the cannabis plant yields a lot of different chemicals with varied effects. We call them alkaloids because they're chemicals that come from a plant source. The two that you should be most familiar with are delta-9 THC, or what we call THC, and cannabidiol, or CBD. So THC is the reason people use recreational marijuana. It causes the high. It has all the relaxation effects and the euphoria that people are usually looking for when they smoke recreational marijuana. CBD has none of that. It doesn't have any of the psychoactive effects, but is appealing for a variety of possible medical effects, including, for example, the treatment of pediatric epilepsy. Now, CBD, to be clear, is not medical marijuana. It's legal for sale in the drugstore. You could just buy it. You don't have to go to a dispensary. You don't need a prescription. So it has a lot of access that people enjoy. Buyer beware, though, because its contents are not guaranteed, and because it's not a drug and it's not really regulated. So contamination does occur. Every once in a while, something makes its way into CBD oil that shouldn't be there and people get sick. So speaking of people getting sick by taking something that they didn't mean to take, I want to make one quick note on something which is not the same as cannabis, and that is synthetic cannabinoids. Sometimes go by the name of K2 or spice or a lot of different street names. These are lab chemicals that scientists developed to study the effects of cannabis on the brain. And somehow these chemicals made their way onto the drug marketplace and were marketed as having the same effects as cannabis. But they are really very bad news. They were intended to mimic the effects of marijuana, but they really have very unpredictable and dangerous side effects and should never be used. Even if they're not contaminated with rat poison, they have all kinds of effects. They make people severely anxious, agitated, and can have kidney and heart damage. So this is a product that should really be avoided and is completely different from everything that we're now going to say about cannabis. So back to cannabis. How does it affect your brain? So it turns out your brain has a whole system already in place for the effects of cannabis, which is called the endocannabinoid system. It's hardwired in there. It is not put there so people can get high on cannabis, but to regulate basic functions like memory, temperature, appetite control, as well as higher cortical functions. So there are these chemicals circulating in your body called endocannabinoids that don't come from the marijuana plant, but that stimulate these receptors, and they're the same receptors that are stimulated by cannabis. This is one of the concerns people bring up as it pertains to the developing brain and the effects of cannabis, because we know this system is in place, and we don't know how taking cannabis from the outside affects the development of these neurotransmission systems. And we do know that taking cannabis does kind of hijack the body's internal controls in this important system. We don't know exactly how, but there's a few receptors all over the brain in a few important areas. The first is the amygdala. So this is the reason people use cannabis. It's the center of emotions. It has all the relaxation and euphoria that people seek when they use cannabis, the amygdala. The basal ganglia and cerebellum, here in the back, modulate movement and motor control and the planning of motor control. So how am I going to go about doing this activity with my muscles? And this underlies some coordination and concerns regarding driving performance. The hypothalamus controls temperature and appetite, and is why people high on cannabis get so famously hungry. Now, interestingly, the brainstem here, which is how the body does very important things like keep breathing, has almost no cannabinoid receptors. And that's good news in this instance, because this is why cannabis overdose does not cause people to stop breathing, although that may not be true in very young children with very high doses. But this is the reason that cannabis overdose does not look, for example, like a heroin overdose. Lastly, the cerebral cortex. So this is the center of highest intellectual function in the human brain. And it contains not only the highest amount of cannabinoid receptors of all the receptors in the brain, but the cannabinoid receptor is the most common receptor in the cerebral cortex. More than dopamine or serotonin or any of the other neurotransmitters, the cannabinoids are all over the cerebral cortex. And what does it do? Cerebral cortex is responsible for executive function, divided attention, decision-making, and allowing us to process complex stimuli in our environment. So cannabis is all over the brain. So the clinical effects, I think many are probably familiar with. It makes you happy, it's relaxing, it enhances your perception of the outside world and the world around you. It very much increases appetite. It causes red eyes or conjunctival injection, increased heart rate, and then at higher doses can cause effects that the user is not looking for, like anxiety, paranoia, acute psychosis, and impairment. So as cannabis access has increased, the number of formulations has exploded. And keeping track can be a little bit difficult. But the one where most people are familiar with is the bud or the flower, which is pictured at the top here, which is smoked, for example, in a joint or cigarette. Then there's products where the active components are crushed and squeezed out of the plant through a few techniques. So concentrates are generally commercial products, and the active ingredients are pulled out without heat or organic solvents. Sometimes it's a carbon dioxide method, or there's a few different ways of doing that. These are concentrated liquids, that look a little bit like e-liquid for cigarettes sometimes, and they are often used in vaporizers and vape pens, and also in highly concentrated medical products. Extracts are a little different and are created usually in a heated process, often with organic volatile solvents like butane, propane, and sometimes this is an at-home operation and is inherently more dangerous. And then resins, dangerous in the production of it. Resins are the solid or semi-solid products of either concentrates and extracts, and some of these are pictured over here. And edibles are anything from brownies, cakes, to candies and gummies, etc., which are made either with using the leaves or pouring in a concentrate or extract product into the recipe. But even the bud is not what it used to be. So marijuana today is much, much, much more concentrated in THC concentration than it used to be. And that does definitely take some people by surprise, and in some cases lands them in the emergency department. And the different variations and different formulations have concentrations which vary widely. So the dry herb or the bud is concentrated about 5 to 20% with some variation. The wax, those semi-solid butane hash oil products, are as high as 90%. So is CO2 oil, which is a concentrate and maybe up to 90%, and edibles are approximately 10% per serving. So let's talk about dose. So talking about dose is important when we consider packaging and regulation, because there's a lot of variation in individual products. And estimating the actual dose in anything has a little wiggle room, but in general, a hit from a marijuana cigarette is about 2 milligrams, depending on the concentration of THC. The total amount in a medical edible is about 100 milligrams, capsules about 100 milligrams, and concentrates or tincture can be really high. So some medical concentrates are 4,000 milligrams in a container. And when you start to think about risk calculation, for example, with pediatric exposures, it's easy to see how you could get a very consequential exposure in a young child. And the effects take place at different times and last different durations. So a person smoking marijuana will begin to experience the effect almost instantly within about 10 minutes. That effect will peak and last about 4 to 6 hours. The person can self-titrate and take just another hit when the effects begin to wane, and that is why smoked cannabis has far fewer overdose events. Edibles, on the other hand, take a lot longer to take effect, as long as an hour or two, and can last up to 24 hours, and sometimes leads to people taking too much up front and getting into trouble. So here's a graphical depiction of that. You can see here at time 0, red is smoking delivery. At time 0, right after a hit is taken, it goes right into the bloodstream and achieves a plasma concentration. And then that concentration drops and fades and is gone by about 4 hours. In contrast, ingested THC, at time 0, there's nothing in the blood, starts to show up about 1 hour in, and gradually makes its way up, and then hangs out at about 5 hours, and then comes down over a period of 24 hours. So this can be tricky, and the kinetics of edibles can lead to a dangerous dose stacking phenomenon. And this was detailed in the New York Times by op-ed columnist Maureen Dowd, her personal experience. So she flew out to Colorado to be a marijuana tourist and bought a granola bar, and got back to her room and took a dose of this granola bar, so a little serving size of a granola bar, which contained 16 servings. So she essentially bit off a corner of it and waited, and nothing happened. So she bit off a little bit more, and still nothing happened, and then got impatient or figured it was, not very strong, and ate the whole thing. And for the next 24 hours, had what she describes as a terrifying experience where she was in her hotel room, paranoid, hallucinating, afraid people were coming to kill her, and really had a very, very unpleasant marijuana toxicity because of that dose stacking and not understanding how long it takes edibles really to take effect. So what are the health effects? So cannabis has a variety of health effects, some with a lot of evidence behind them, and some of which are still kind of being investigated and not really proven. And that is true both for efficacy in the medical marijuana realm as well as safety in the recreational marijuana realm. And I'm not going to go into the medical indications right now, but I would refer you to this very exhaustive monograph that was just put out by the National Academy of Sciences, which basically they undertook a very thorough systematic review of all of the evidence surrounding, does cannabis help with asthma, anxiety, chronic pain? Is cannabis bad for you because it causes an increased prevalence of mental illness? All of these questions are really contained in this report, and it's, I think, required reading for this topic. So moving on specifically to recreational and the health effects, there's one way in which legalization may have a positive effect on health, at least one way, and that is that legalization implies not just that it's not against the law to have or use cannabis, but setting up a legalized recreational program in a state means establishing a framework for licensure and testing and regulation of the products that are being commercially sold. And when that happens, those products are tested for concentration and contents, they're labeled, they're lab standards, and they're tested for contaminants and things like solvents, pesticides, heavy metals, mold spores, etc. So the product is cleaner and contains what it says it contains and doesn't contain anything it doesn't say it contains. So that is a benefit. What about adverse effects? So the following comes primarily from that National Academy of Science report, as well as the experience of states which have gone before us in New Jersey with legalization. That's Colorado, Oregon, Washington, and I want to just take 1 second and say a special thanks in particular to the Oregon and Alaska Poison Center, who were instrumental in sharing their experience with us here in New Jersey. So cannabis poisoning in adults. Grown-ups poisoning themselves with cannabis. So yes, that happens. This is an example of a case that was called into a poison center. A 16-year-old cannabis-naive girl tried her brother's dab. So I'll describe that in a little bit, but it's essentially an extract, an oily extract, which is smoked in a pipe called an oil rig. Anyway, she does this, she starts to feel unwell, she gets pale, throws up, gets dizzy, and goes to the ER by ambulance. In the ED, she has a fast heart rate of 131, she has dilated pupils, she's tachycardic, she's flushed, and exceedingly anxious, and having what appears to the ED physician to be a panic attack. So cases like these and others absolutely increase when legalization takes place. So here's the report from the Washington Poison Control Center after legalization and increased access began in 2005. And then full legalization and liberalization progressed and took place right here. And so you can see each time a change took place, the number of calls reported to the Washington Poison Center went up, and there was a pretty dramatic rise after full legalization. Same at the Oregon Poison Center. This is called mapped quarterly, and as access increased, so did calls, and possession was legalized here in 2015, and early retail sales began in 2000, a little later, and it just went up and up. And so in Colorado, so marijuana-related emergency department visits have increased every year since legalization. What does cannabis poisoning look like? For the majority of patients, they're just uncomfortable. They feel anxious, they have palpitations, they may throw up, and the effects wane after a few hours. Some of the more severe are generally associated with higher doses, and that's psychosis, agitation, seizures, even coma. In extreme circumstances, some of these patients are impossible to control in the emergency department and can be a danger to either themselves or staff or both. And I've seen that firsthand with regular old cannabis, not synthetic cannabis, not contaminated with anything, just very concentrated cannabis that the user did not expect to have such a strong effect. By and large, in the ED, we observe them and wait for the effects to wear off. Excuse me. But in some cases, that does not occur. And in rare cases, the patients are agitated to such an extent that they require ICU admission, even end up on a ventilator. That's very rare, but it does happen. Risk factors for these exposures seem to be naive users, but the biggest risk factor is definitely edibles because of that dose stacking we talked about before. Edibles and kind of the surprise high concentration products, whether it's bud or a concentrated liquid. This is a PSA that was put out by the state of Alaska, which I really like. Start low, go slow, and talks about how edibles can sneak up on you and are tricky to dose. And you should take a little bit at a time and know it's going to take a while to take effect. Another cause of emergency department visits by adults, outside of just getting too much THC, are burn injuries stemming from the production of butane hash oil. So I mentioned earlier, this is a pretty dangerous process. BHO goes by a lot of names: dab, shatter, amber, glass, and is a very potent product, and there's a large demand for it. It's an extract, again, which means it crushes and pulls out the active ingredients in the cannabis plant. So these are plant clippings in this diagram. By soaking it, it's crushed up and soaked in a volatile solvent. Here is butane. And then that mixture is put over a flame so that it evaporates, leaving behind only a waxy substance, which is up to 90% THC. So really, really concentrated, and it kind of looks like this. But when you heat up a volatile solvent, not surprisingly, sometimes things blow up. And that absolutely happens. Just as with meth labs, methamphetamine labs, which pose a significant fire risk, so does BHO extraction. And also, not surprisingly, BHO burns do occur. This is a study from Colorado in 2015, where they reported there are 31 cases, all of which occurred after liberalization in that state. And they had 31 predominantly male with flash burns, median total body surface area of about 10%, which is not insignificant, median length of stay about 10 days, upper extremity burns or burns to the face, to the head or neck, and 6 of the 31 patients required being put on a ventilator and intubated. So these were significant exposures, and we should just be aware of this process and know that these injuries may be severe, they may involve several people, and it's just because of this inherently dangerous method of creating BHO, particularly in people who are kind of trying to do it in their backyard, if you will. Okay, pediatric poisoning, pediatric cannabis poisoning. This is a real case which occurred in Alaska of a 1-year-old boy who ingested a chunk of that resinous homemade BHO. And he became sleepy. They called poison control. He was sent to the hospital in an ambulance. He had a seizure in the ambulance. And then the emergency department became comatose, had occasional jerking movements, which maybe were seizure activity, and a high heart rate. And about an hour after arrival, stops breathing and is bagged, so he's basically, ventilation is supported with a bag and a mask for about an hour, and then they were able to intubate him because they needed a person experienced in pediatric intubation. Once that happened, he was intubated and transported to a tertiary center and was on a vent for 2 days and came off and did well without sequelae. Now, the story has a happy ending, but anybody who's cared for a child in the emergency department knows that any time a child has to be intubated, it's a life-threatening situation and it could end the wrong way. So this is a very serious exposure, and this baby got lucky. So soon after full legalization, the Children's Hospital in Denver started seeing a surge of pediatric poison exposures from marijuana. And this is the National Poison Center data, so that database I talked about at the very beginning that we all upload our cases to. This is the National Poison Center data, which looked across the country at pediatric exposures in states in which cannabis was not legal, states where cannabis was decriminalized, and states which were kind of in transition. So decriminalized is another kind of related term, which essentially means it's just not unlawful to possess. Nonetheless, this is basically states with increased access and some form of liberalization, whether it's medicinal or legalized, recreational. And exposures went up for sure in those states, and a bit in states in which cannabis access was just kind of starting to loosen up. Again, they saw this in Colorado, this time from the Rocky Mountain Poison Center. After legalization, there was a doubling in volume of children 0 to 5 years of age with marijuana exposure. This is before, and this is after, and this is Colorado. This is a national study looking at states with legalization and those without. And you can see it makes a big difference in terms of pediatric exposures. So rate per million children in states where there is legalized marijuana absolutely goes up. So how does pediatric cannabis toxicity differ from the people we just talked about, the adults? They're both usually edibles, or has a preponderance of edibles, because they're unpredictable and highly concentrated, and particularly in kids. We know this from poison prevention. When it looks like candy, it's going to be attractive to a child, and that is going to cause a poisoning. And that's why medicines don't look like candy, or we try not to make them look like candy, and it is what leads edibles to be a very significant cause of poisoning in kids. These might be retail edibles, like the gummies pictured here, or concentrates or resins, but they can also be homegrown or homemade edibles. And that's because people don't lock up brownies the way they might lock up a concentrated cannabis liquid. So there is a little cognitive barrier there to saying, I just made this batch of cookies, let me put them high up and out of reach, because that's just not something that people normally do. So those homemade edibles do pose a significant risk, in particular in kids. A higher rate of respiratory depression. Kids stop breathing seemingly more frequently than adults. And I just told you that the brainstem is not a big site of cannabis action, but this may be a fact that kids just ingest a lot more per kilo or for their weight, or there may be something just particularly unique about children and cannabis that we don't yet understand, but we do definitely see this more in children. In this study in Oregon, 73% belong to a family member, and that's not surprising. Kids get things around their home. This is a review of exposures in the Denver Children's Hospital, looking at symptoms, evaluation, and treatment. You can see many of the children got lethargic. Many of them got admitted, and several underwent CT scanning, so that's CAT scanning, which is no small decision in this age when we try to minimize radiation in kids. So these are consequential exposures. And kids do share what they find. We hear this in the Poison Center, not just with cannabis products, but with pharmaceutical and illicit drugs. Kids find stuff at home and they bring it in, and as you can imagine, it causes quite a ruckus. So this happens with marijuana edibles as well. And adults accidentally share their edibles too. So earlier this year, New Jersey Poison Center, we put out our kind of annual release about Halloween and watch your Halloween candy. Make sure there's not a marijuana edible that makes its way into it. And some of the response we got back was, well, you know, why would people give out their marijuana edibles? That's crazy. You know, they want to hold on to them. But I think that mistakes do happen, and these kinds of exposures are reported, just confusion. And so marijuana edibles looking like candy really is a bit of a setup. I also want to point out that there's no other drug or substance that's found in a vehicle that looks this attractive to young kids. We don't package drugs as food with good reason. So here's another study looking at who is impacted most by edible marijuana poisoning, age group by years. So here's the adults, kind of smart enough to mostly not poison themselves too much, and this is the kids under 5. So children are definitely, young children are disproportionately affected by edibles, and they look delicious. So it's really not hard to imagine how that could happen. So let's talk about dose. How much is too much? How much, if a child eats it, makes us worried here at the Poison Center? You know, or can we say, well, that was just a taste, and it's probably okay. So this is the most definitive review on this topic. It was a retrospective review of 38 children, so not just young children, but all the way up through adolescence. So some were naive and some were marijuana-using adolescents. Nonetheless, they looked at the amount of THC per kilo ingested and the likelihood of just being able to be observed and go home, admission to the floor, or admission to the PICU. And that fell in right around where patients started to need an intervention or some kind of treatment, around 7 milligrams per kilo. Other centers have reported that their threshold for toxicity appears to be just about 10 milligrams, period. So it just depends a little bit on the fact that the numbers are small and we're still getting a sense for what is a toxic dose, but it's somewhere around 10, 20, 30 milligrams. And we send patients in here at New Jersey if they are symptomatic or they have any exposure that's over about 10 milligrams, if we can calculate the dose. So pediatric cannabis poisoning is mostly edibles. They do get sicker. They have a tendency to do so. They often get more intensive evaluation and treatment, and they are preventable. I'm going to talk about strategies at the end of this talk. I want to spend a few minutes talking about the concerns in pregnancy and breastfeeding. So we're in a time where the perceived risk for cannabis use is very low. And that's probably owing to just the publicity and broadening of medical marijuana. People think it's a medicine, how can it be bad? And some even think it's a natural product. So I may not take a medicine while I'm pregnant, but cannabis is natural. And maybe it's better for me to take than other things I might take in pregnancy. And so this risk perception distortion has reached some of the pregnant population, as detailed in this article in February of last year in the New York Times. Should we be concerned? Well, here's what we know. THC passes through the placenta and it passes through breast milk. And a number of societies have weighed in on this, and you can see in the lower right-hand corner. There's strong evidence to demonstrate a decrease in birth weight in babies born to mothers who use cannabis. There is emerging but not conclusive evidence to raise concerns about birth complications and then effects on the child, IQ, cognition, academic performance, and attentiveness later in life. And as I mentioned, that endocannabinoid system already has a lot of important functions. So the impact of altering it in the fetus and young baby should give us pause and warrant serious consideration. We got to figure this out before this kind of gets out of hand and there's a lot more use in pregnancy, because we really have reason to suspect that there are a lot of effects, some of which are already proven. So the American Academy of Pediatrics and the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology have both released pretty strong statements discouraging the use of cannabis during pregnancy as well as during breastfeeding. And I very much agree. I'm just going to touch on a couple of other considerations in the interest of time. So adolescent use. How will legalization impact adolescents? Will they use it more? Will they use it, better? Here's what we know. According to Monitoring the Future, perception of harm among adolescents of marijuana continues to decrease. And we know, just from drug abuse in general, that when risk perception goes down, usage goes up. And this is happening and will continue to happen. And we don't yet know the impact on future problem cannabis use and the effects on cannabis addiction, which does happen in a segment of the population. That remains to be seen. Motor vehicle safety. We know cannabis causes impaired driving, and experience in other states demonstrates legalization is associated with an increase in motor vehicle collisions in which THC is involved. And it's estimated that as many as 12% of weekend nighttime drivers nationwide have cannabis in their system. So again, we have to monitor this and have standards for when you can drive after using, and certain people who really need to have their usage restricted, like people with commercial driving licenses. General decrease in risk perception means increased use across the board. And the effects on addiction and the exacerbation and emergence of psychiatric disease, particularly anxiety, panic attacks, depression, schizophrenia, are also being studied and warrant caution and resources. So what can we do? How can we proceed in the best way to anticipate and prevent these things from happening? So the first thing that I like to think about is serving size. Smart legislation and implementation can put goalposts on how marijuana is sold, and this can make a big difference. We know children develop consequential toxicity somewhere in the area of about 10 milligrams and up, and that number in adults is harder to tease out, but probably at or above 50 milligrams. So it makes sense to limit dose size to about 10 milligrams or below. Looking at pack size. So pack size, in contrast to dose size, is the number of serving sizes or doses in one package. So that granola bar we talked about with Maureen Dowd had 16 doses in it. And that's too many. That's a lot of doses. And I would defy anyone on this call to eat 1 square of a Hershey bar. And then you can see the problem. And children in particular don't eat half a candy bar, they don't eat half a brownie. And so we have to be devil's advocates and assume that in some scenarios, even though it is labeled not to eat the whole thing, eating the whole thing is going to happen. So pack size really matters. It even matters with food. If you get a small 100-calorie bag of chips with your sandwich, you finish it. And if you get a 250-calorie bag of chips with your sandwich, you're likely to finish it. And so pack size really does influence human behavior and can make particularly edible products safer. So packaging and child-proofing, or what we call child-resistant. Nothing is actually child-proof. We know from poison prevention packaging that if a package is harder to open and less appealing to do so, that can prevent a child from being poisoned. So some measures which should be included are child-resistant closure. So the definition of that is a two-mechanism closure. So if it's a prescription drug bottle, you have to push down and turn. And a lot of what's being used are these zip-top bags with a clip. They should be resealable. So just because mom opens a bag of gummy bears, the need for that bag to be child-resistant doesn't go away, and that bag should be resealable with a two-mechanism closure. Opaque packaging, so kids not being able to see the appealing contents, can help. It should not be appealing to children, shouldn't contain cartoons, and should avoid lookalikes. So it's kind of amazing what's been put out there, and not too surprising that it's caused some trouble. So take a look at this. The first time I saw this, I couldn't believe it, honestly. But these look not only delicious, but look like favorite candy bars. This looks like Halloween candy. And this should not happen. We can sell, edible products can be sold without looking like a Nestle Crunch bar, because it causes a dangerous situation with kids. Labeling. So labeling should include a clear indication of what's in the product. Should say there's THC in here, this is not for kids. It should say that it's dangerous to children, not safe in pregnancy, or in some language may not be safe in pregnancy. Those labels and warnings should be at the store and on the product, and should be not only on the individual package, but should be on the exit package, which is used to carry the product out of the store. Here's an example of a label required in Washington State using not for kids, and actually this is the Mr. Yuck poison control label that's used by a lot of poison centers nationwide. And this is what Washington requires cannabis products to contain. Looking at other labeling guidelines, so in Portland, they took a page out of some of the tobacco legislation to require the following. And I think it's worthy of consideration. Labels should be as large as possible on front of packages, not the sides. Should contain clear, direct, and accurate messages. Should word messages simply. Include color pictures which elicit an emotional response, and the labels should be changed regularly to avoid overexposure, to avoid that like, yeah, effect that sometimes people have when they read these warnings. Advertising, so this targets that adolescent population in particular, should not include pictures of a guy smoking pot who looks about 21 or looks maybe a little younger than 21, because that says to the 16-year-old, hey, that's a cool thing to do. So that shouldn't happen. And careful placement of advertising, not allowing brand name sponsorships, not allowing gifts for proof of purchase like buy 10 and get one free, and avoiding pop-up ads. Lastly, establishing robust surveillance and the resources to deal with signals as they arise. So we have to keep our eyes on driving safety. We need to be specific in our consideration of monitoring people with, for example, commercial driver's licenses and other employment where executive function, et cetera, is essential. Just because it is legal doesn't mean it is okay to do on the job. Monitoring, just like alcohol. Just monitoring the health effects of the products themselves is obviously a logical role for the Poison Control Center, but not just us. Also public health laboratories like we have in New Jersey and many other agencies which are invested in this. Surveillance will allow for detection of trends like contaminated drugs, usage patterns, clusters of usage causing harm, et cetera. So this is kind of the same that we do for things like food and drugs. Like the last couple of weeks, we've all stopped eating romaine lettuce because it's been associated with E. coli. And that kind of thing is found out when surveillance is in place and can react and respond. And that is how we find out about these things. And we can't manage what we don't measure. So we do have to have this surveillance in place. And then the need for mental health and social services will likely increase, and we have to be prepared for that. So we pulled our NJPIES data just to see what's already happening, and this is in kids. And we are seeing an increase in children being exposed. So you can see here on the left, the numbers are small, but this is all children under equal or under 5 years of age. And in the last few years, particularly as other states have started to legalize, and that's right around here, we've definitely seen an increase in exposure. And we will expect this to go up because it just naturally will. So in conclusion, cannabis is here to stay. We're in a time of a lot of transformation of legislation and access. And although there are ramifications, as I said, in many realms, both positive and negative, we should be prepared for the health consequences. Anticipation and prevention is key for the ones we already know about, and surveillance is essential not only for those that we know about, but for the things that we don't quite know are going to happen yet. And that's why there's such a vital role for public health and all of us who are on the phone here to be involved in the process. So I thank you all very much for your attention. And I'd like to thank my colleagues at a number of these poison centers who helped advise us in this, and my staff at NJPIES and the Rutgers School of Public Health for giving us this opportunity to talk about it. Thanks so much.
Dr. Calello, thank you so much. This is very, very informative. And I'm wondering if you are still okay to hear just a couple of questions. I know we're just nearing the end of our time.
Sure. Yeah, we can take a few.
Okay, we'll just do one question that's come in is asking if you can discuss the difference between sativa and indica. I'm not certain if I'm pronouncing those correctly.
Yeah, there are descriptions of both of those, and sativa they both do contain the alkaloids, and it's a little inexact, but users do report that they have somewhat different effects, but they do both contain the alkaloids. I think sativa is the much more common used for recreational use.
Okay,
but they're both marijuana plants who come up with THC and CBD and all the others.
Great, thank you. And the last question is have many of your prevention strategies been incorporated into the bill going through the New Jersey legislature?
Yeah, I actually think a lot of this has been considered and is in there. The knowledge that we have to talk about pack size and dose size and labeling and packaging is being considered. If you take a look at the bill, a lot of that is in there. I think, though, that the details of it some of that needs to be ironed out now, but a lot of that is an implementation. And so I think we're on the right track, but we just, really need to be conscious of the details. What is that label going to say? Where are we going to put it? And things like that I think will be important as we move forward.
Okay. Well, Dr. Calello, thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who was able to join. Again, our apologies for some of the technical difficulties, but the program will be available on our YouTube channel at Rutgers Training, and we'll share that link with all who had registered. And thank you very much. And thank you, everyone, for joining us.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.